Welcome to the Classroom Café, where it's all about brewing the conversation between fellow educators. This special presentation is brought to you by the United Federation of Teachers and the union's Member Assistance Program. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this podcast inspires you, nourishes you, and motivates you. Now let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Classroom Café podcast. I'm Selma Williams, and we are joined here today by our co-host,
Janice Acosta.
And today we have two special guests. I'll introduce the first, Caitlin. Caitlin Hanvey is a licensed creative art therapist with an extensive history in various mental health settings over the past 8 years. She also has had a paper published in 2019 that evaluated the effects of creative arts therapy on children in the Psych ED setting. Welcome, Caitlin.
Today we also have Asha Hanna joining us. Asha is an artist born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. She paints surreal portraits of powerful women she encounters. Asha received her Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Painting from Howard University, and today still works out of Brooklyn, where she describes her clean, organized studio as her happy place. We're so grateful to have you, Asha. Thanks for being here.
I'm excited to be here.
So with this podcast being released in July, we know that our educators and our listeners may have a little bit more time on their hands. So we wanted to introduce art as a way of not just an activity that you can engage in, but also talk about the benefits that it can have for us mentally. So that's why we brought Caitlin and Asha here to have this lovely conversation. So Caitlin, you have an extensive history, an impressive history of being an art therapist. Tell us a little bit about that.
So being an art therapist is a little bit different approach than you might find in a classroom with an art teacher. We don't come at art as a way of teaching skills necessarily, but as a way of expressing ourselves. And the idea is that any mark you make, any creation that comes from your hands is important and reflective of who you are in some way. So that could be a scribble, it could be the color you choose. And I think an important thing that art therapists are always trying to tell people is that you do not need to know how to draw to engage in art. So I think that's something that is a main challenge that we definitely come up against in our profession with adults and children. Art therapy and art is not just for children. It can be great for anyone. So I think that's something that we like to get out there.
Yeah. What drew you to art therapy?
I actually came to art therapy through my own art practice. My undergraduate degree is in fine arts. And when I was out of college for a few years, I started engaging more in my own art practice, more not as a way to be a professional artist, but just processing what was going on internally for myself. And I found it so valuable. And so when I became aware of art therapy as a field, that felt like a natural progression for me.
Nice. So how many forms of art are there? Like, I only think about, because I've got kids, right? I think about paint, I think about crayons, I think about just the very primitive forms of art, but I'm sure there are so many more. So how many different types and ways can we express ourselves through art?
So there's numerous ways. There's something I just wanted to point out as well, is that when we say creative arts therapies, that doesn't just include drawing and painting. I'm an art therapist, so I engage more with those materials and different art-making materials, but there are also dance movement therapists who are also under the creative arts therapy umbrella, and drama therapists, poetry therapists, so there's a lot of different expressive modalities involved. But to answer your question a little more, aside from the drawing and painting tools, something that's really helpful sometimes are collage, using pre-printed images that can alleviate some of the stress around not being able to draw or feeling some judgment around self-judgment in how you express yourself. sculpture, using found objects or materials from the environment, leaves, sticks, things you collect at the park that you can trace, or collage. There's a lot of different ways that you can use just things you have lying around.
Collage made me think about vision boards, right? In the pandemic, everybody was doing vision boards, and the benefit that people talk about is how it helps them to focus on the future, right? And that's kind of something that works in the realm of mental health too, right? We want to keep looking towards the future, moving forward. So yes, I totally see collages as being therapeutic in that sense too.
I think about younger children, right? And can you use their art to interpret their feelings? Like, is that something that you've done, or you've seen done, or you've heard of being the way to allow them to express and really take it literally?
So that's like something that's a little bit contentious at times. There are some guidelines that you come across about how to interpret art. The general rule as an art therapist is that the only person who can tell you what something means is the artist. So a story that you hear through grad school and is kind of repeated is this: there's a child in the class, he creates a drawing that's all black, and the teacher gets worried, approaches the parents, and when they sit the kid down and say, "Why did you make this all black drawing that's really scary to us?" he says, "That was the only color left in the box." So it's really important to always defer to whatever they say it's about. Even little kids, you can definitely see developmentally where kids are at. There's a progression. You go from scribble drawings through the tadpole people that they make with the arms and legs coming out of a circle. And then it kind of progresses as they get more developed. So that's a way you can see that progression. But in terms of assigning meaning to different things, that's where art therapists kind of have a different skill set. But we also don't interpret art in that way. So I wouldn't look at someone's drawing and say, well, this shows that this person has this. I may have questions about specific things that come up, but I wouldn't diagnose or make assumptions.
So I guess the next question I want to ask is it ever okay to confront someone about their art? Whether gently, of course, but that may not have been released, like you stumble upon art. Is it ever okay to say, hey, what's this about? Especially for younger children or teens or...
Yeah, definitely. I think the rule is to ask open-ended questions. I saw this image, it's really interesting to me. What do you think this is? Could you tell me a little bit about it? This part looks really interesting. I see you put a lot of energy. There's a lot of things going on here. Tell me about this color choice. There's a lot of questions that you can see, but you don't want to say, oh, this picture looks really scary. You kind of keep it open and see where they go with it. And art is a way of communicating. So I think that sometimes people are surprised by what they draw, and when you start asking questions, they start to explore what is going on for them. So I think it's always okay to ask questions.
Nice. So it's a good way to start conversation or to continue engaging a specific client or child or student. Okay.
Absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit more about your work you did in 2019? I think it's very interesting.
So at that time I was working in a hospital in the Bronx in the psychiatric emergency room. I worked with adults, children, and adolescents, and specifically on the adolescent and child unit, which was a short-term stay. It's an emergency room. People aren't supposed to be there more than 72 hours. It was a place which could be really frightening for a kid, and we had one room, and within that room we had kids ranging from 5 to 18. So it was volatile at times and chaotic, and I'm sure many members could imagine what that might be like. So I was lucky enough to work with a dance movement therapist who was amazing called Callie Tepper-Lewis. And she and I developed a program that was designed to try to create a sense of community on the unit, to kind of engender these behaviors, like pro-social behaviors, kind of being aware of the people around them, engaging, so feel a bit safer. And so we did that by running a dual modality group. So we would incorporate dance movement therapy with art therapy. And it was really interesting, and we did a lot of trial of how the best way to run it was. And it was really a great intervention, and it was really interesting for us. And having each other running the group together, we were able to hold the space a little better, as well as talk to other staff around to try to integrate it into the unit. And so then we wrote a paper kind of explaining what we did, and because there's not really a lot of literature on running groups in that setting, because it's not the CPEP, which is what they call the psychiatric emergency room programs in New York. I think there are a lot of therapists working in them at the moment, but it's still fairly new, and because it is such a transitional space, it doesn't have a lot of focus on it from a therapeutic perspective.
So what kind of results did you see?
So we kind of came at it trying to promote, like I said, pro-social behaviors. So we described that as things like sharing, the art portion would be on a mural paper, so everyone was working on the same sheet of paper. How they navigated that space, if they drew a big box around their part of the picture and didn't want anyone else to come in, or if we could encourage them to, how would you join your picture to someone else's, and try to bridge the gaps that way. And the dance part of it would be the first part of the group, and that was great because that moving in synchrony together, like that sync of movement, really created a bonding sense. And Hallie, the dance therapist, she was really great at encouraging the kids to play and create images to go with their movements, which we could then carry through to the art. So we saw good results. It was varied. The kids had a lot of different issues they were dealing with. So we were just trying to create a really safe space, and I think we were successful.
Nice. I mean, that is such great work, and I that's a program that I wish every ER, right, had, and because that has to be difficult to engage different people every day, because you said it's a kind of a revolving door, like not a revolving door, but there are different children in there every day. They're not there to stay, so that has to be hard to engage them and keep them engaged and through a program. So great work.
Thank you.
As a creative arts therapist, what are some of the benefits of art?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many benefits. In the same way that therapy is effective, talk therapy, because it's expressing your feelings verbally, it's just another way to express what's going on for yourself. I think there's been a lot of studies that show that it can assist with stress, the processing of trauma. There's a lot of different aspects to it from a mental health perspective, but I think overall it's a way to kind of check in with yourself, get to know yourself a little better, and just explore what's happening in your life, and it can be really powerful.
I think that's a good segue to have Asha talk a little bit about her own experience. So, as we mentioned before, Asha is an artist in Brooklyn, and she shares on her websites that art is her form of therapy. Tell us a little bit about what that's like.
So art for me has always been a way to visually express my thoughts and my feelings. And when I think back to when I first started drawing, it was a way to occupy my time. I obviously wasn't super conscious about what I was creating and what it really meant. But when I look back on all of my artwork and just see the progression as I became more aware of my feelings and my life became more complex, my art changed.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so I'll say when I was in college, for sure. That's when my art became way more complex because I was developing all these relationships, intimate relationships, new friendships. I was in like a new location. I moved to DC after spending my entire life in New York. A lot of stresses and things that were happening and changing. That's definitely when my art became way more intuitive in terms of what was happening in my life in the moment, and it directly reflecting in my art. And I would say the most recent big event that had happened in my life was right before COVID. I ended a really long relationship, 5-year relationship, and then COVID hit the next month. And definitely was a stressful time.
Imagine.
Yeah.
So I immediately got into my studio without even thinking and just started creating. And I will say that when people see the art that I created in that time period, it's probably the most responsive that people have been to pieces that I've created. And it also helped me process any emotions or thoughts that I had at the time, any depression that I was going through, trying to understand why things were happening without having to vocally express it. So yeah, this definitely has been super helpful for me throughout my life.
So when you look back at it, and our others look back at it with you, does that take you back to that time, or it's more of a release into moving forward?
It's definitely a release. It definitely takes me back into that time period also, because I know what I was going through in that. It's almost like a timepiece, like a time capsule, where it captures that time period for me. And like I said, when I look back at all the pieces that I've created over the years, even into my childhood, I am just like, wow, I see why I used that color or created that specific image. It's super reflective and it's almost like a diary. So yeah,
It's very personal too.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We use art as a form of healing, right? So revisiting those pieces, does it reopen those wounds? I guess is my ultimate concern, right?
I would say it depends. And I think that even outside of art, even if you were to look back at a picture, or maybe if you have a literal diary where you're writing down whatever's happening in the moment, you look back at it, depending on where you are in the moment that you're looking back at it, it could. But I feel like that's also part of the healing process. When I was closer to that breakup in 2020, I definitely was way more emotional for me than now when I look back at it. I'm just like, wow, look how far I've come from that moment. But yeah, it definitely can tear open the wounds.
And this is a question for both of you. For both of you as artists, have there been times where you've just randomly, felt inspired by just a regular day in the life, and you're like, I feel like creating something, and then you create something and you step back and you look at it, or maybe even look at it later on down the road, and you're like, oh, I was going through something here, or there was something that was happening here. Has that ever happened to either of you?
I feel like it's happened to me I'm from Australia, and when I first moved here, it was a big transition. It was in my early 20s, and I didn't know anyone, and I was drawing a lot. And when I look back at that time, I see someone who was lost and scared, and things that I didn't identify in that moment, but I feel like, knowing myself, I look back and I can see that present in some of the pictures that I made.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with you in that, because I've had that same experience when I was in college, and when I look at the art that I was creating at the time, it was super fluid, a lot of movement, no decisive imagery. It was just kind of all over the place. I was using a lot of colors, and compared to my art now, it's way more specific. And I definitely was going through a lot and trying to figure out where I fit and what I want to do and what will my life look like in 5-10 years. And even though I think about those things now, the picture is way clearer.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah, it's definitely super interesting to look back at.
I really liked the way Asha described that, and it made me think of when you're describing the images that you first made being kind of fluid and a lot of color, and then it's like things moved into focus. And I always imagine, I can kind of imagine like a photo coming into focus, and that idea of getting to know yourself and focusing on what you care about or what's important to you. And it just evoked a really strong image when you were talking about it.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's a great way to document the journey from becoming, a young woman, a child to a young woman to an adult woman, or, a boy to a young man to a fully adult male. It's a good way to keep track of all the growth and all the progress, and to really see your story, in living form, right? How do you think educators can implement more art, even if they're not an art teacher, right? You don't have to be an art teacher to implement art. So what are some ways that you would suggest if someone wanted to infuse that into their classroom, into their homes? How could they do that?
Well, I think that in the classroom, depending on the age, it might change depending on the age of the kids, but something that I think any age can do, and which can be something that takes 5 minutes and is just a warm-up, is if you just ask them to make a scribble using their non-dominant hand for a minute. And they don't even have to look at the paper. And then to look at that scribble and try to pull out an image and then make it clearer. So kind of, I describe it sometimes as if you were looking at a cloud and then you create a shape out of the cloud. And just it's just something fun. It doesn't have to mean anything, but it's a kind of nice way to introduce the idea of just exploring and play, and it can be kind of a relaxing thing. It depends how you want to use it, but maybe just as a way, if they're a bit hyped up after lunch or something, maybe it's a good transition into kind of bringing it down.
I like that. And, maybe having a few options available, like giving them choices. I think that's always great with younger kids. Let them buy in and feel like they're making the decision. I think that would be great. That's a great suggestion.
I think choice is really important as something that comes up. And I think Asha mentioned that earlier as well, as like the power you get and the mastery of choice in your life, especially as a kid who doesn't have a lot of choices. So I think choice is really important.
And even practicing deciphering and understanding what it is that's in front of you, what it is that you created, and expressing that. Right? When we think about therapy, like traditional talk therapy, it's really hard to express what it is that we're feeling, what's going on for us mentally, emotionally, even sometimes physically, right? Going to the doctor and you're like, I have a pain. They're like, where? And how does it hurt? And you're like, I don't know. It just hurts. Right? But, having that practice of explaining what it is, what you're seeing, what you created, goes back to what you were saying earlier, Caitlin, about, right? Like, you don't want to assume what it is that the person has created or what the child has created. You want to let them say it in their own words and tell you what it is, because maybe black was just the only color left in the box.
Right. Right.
And I think just to like piggyback off of all of that, just in general, just encouraging that expression. I think sometimes it can be frustrating when you see a student engaging in a different activity than the activity that you presented in. Like you said, Janice, like people express themselves in different ways. So if you see a student sitting there and they're like drawing away or scribbling on their paper, that could be a sign of something else going on. So I would just say, like, just encourage it. Just encourage it. Find resources where they can express that or whatever it is that they're going through, maybe in a different setting, or maybe you should encourage them to go to an art class or, get a sketchbook or something like that.
I think every classroom should be equipped with sketchbooks, all art supplies, even the therapy dog, something to keep, because we as adults have so many emotions and things that we go through every day in a period of an hour. Think about it. Your emotions can be up, down, and every which way. And sometimes I don't even know what's happening with me. So imagine a younger child who doesn't even have the verbiage to say, I feel sad, or I feel, I feel isolated, or whatever disappointed that whatever it is that they're struggling with at the time. And if they could just express that, think about the harmony that the classroom would have, right?
Yeah.
Think about how many less kids would get pushed and things would get thrown. You know what I mean? There would be just, I think it's such an important aspect to learning, to being able to manage emotions in a healthy ways.
I think a lot of our educators are probably more familiar with like the thought of play therapy, because that's something that's in our schools a lot. And play therapy is very similar to art therapy, right? But it's for kids. You have a playroom and there's a lot of toys and lots of different things, and you just follow the child and let them tell you what it is that's happening, what they're acting out. I kind of think about it as like a play therapy for adults. When society has told you adults don't play with toys anymore,
or we don't color anymore,
or we don't color anymore. Yeah. It's a different way for us to express ourselves and what's going on for us.
Yeah, and we've seen a big surge of adult coloring books and just different ways graphically to express yourself, and it's so important.
Circling back to this podcast is being released over the summer. What are some things that Caitlin, you gave some wonderful examples of like different forms of art. What are some things, and Asha, feel free to chime in on this too. What are some things that just people, our listeners, can do to engage in this sort of like therapeutic process for themselves, with their loved ones, with their children, whoever it may be?
Well, I think the summer makes things a little easier sometimes. You can be outside, even just drawing with chalk on the sidewalk, or, collecting things at the park, or just, I think it's always good to use what you have lying around. Don't feel like you have to go out and buy art supplies. If you have a catalog or a magazine, let your kids tear it up or stick it down, or, kind of just do what they want. Pick out an image they like, and if they're young, you can cut it out for them. If they need help with that, just assist them and give them the chance to tell you what to do, which they usually really like.
Yeah, and you just gave me like a really great idea of an activity. Janice had mentioned, I think it was either Janice or Salma, one of you had mentioned like when you make vision boards for like the year. A really cool thing would be super, whether adult, child, or like as a family, you can just like make a summer vision board from like magazines and like different images of what you want to do for the summer, what you want the summer to like look like for you. So that would be a cool activity. Or literally just getting like a piece of paper and whatever crayons or you have around and just go at it. Don't think about it.
I know we talked a lot about like the interpretation of art and how it can be really powerful. Should parents, educators be concerned about asking a child or asking someone to interpret the art that they've created? Like, is that something that they should leave for professionals, or is that something that anyone can engage in?
I think that you know your kid, and if something seems out of the ordinary and then you're seeing images that are concerning to you, I think it's always okay to ask your child. But if you are getting more and more concerned and maybe they're not very communicative, maybe that's a time to start to look at getting some professional help with a therapist or an art therapist, anyone that you think would be good to work with your child. But I think that sometimes asking questions about the art might allow them to open up to you, and so I wouldn't be afraid of asking, just not to ask in a judgmental way or in a way where you're expressing fear to them, where they might feel they have to reassure you and don't really want to tell you what's going on.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of what that would sound like? Like, what would be a good non-judgmental question to ask?
I think you could say anything like, you're creating all these really amazing drawings. Can you tell me about them? Is there a story that goes with it? Getting them to speak about it in the metaphor, like same as play therapy functions, because kids often speak in a metaphor, right? They'll tell you a story about a superhero who's doing this and that, and maybe that actually relates to how they're feeling or how something around them is functioning. So, and then joining them in that story. Oh, they went to the space. What did they do there? Follow it through and see if it allows them to eventually come around to themselves, or gives you maybe even a little more information just from knowing them.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's a great tip. Thank you. Well, thank you, Caitlin, for coming by and telling us a bit about your experience, the incredible work that you've done professionally, and also just giving us a little bit of insight of art therapy, how it can be therapeutic, and how our members and listeners can engage in it for themselves, for their students, for their own families.
Thank you for having me.
And Asha, you lended such a wonderful personal story into this entire conversation. And I think I said a couple times, you are an active artist in Brooklyn. Where can people find your amazing work?
Well, thank you, Janice. You can find me on Instagram. My art page is art by Asha Hanna. So art by my first name, last name. Or you can also go to my website. So it's my last name, hannartstudio.com. And that definitely has way more of like my portfolio, different things that I've been engaged with, way more information. But if you love Instagram, you can also go to my Instagram.
Is any of the work that you spoke about today on those sites?
Absolutely.
Oh, now I've got to go find it.
I know. Will you reveal to us
the link?
Will you reveal to us which ones were you spoke about today?
Absolutely. That's
You don't have to.
No, that's a part of being an artist. Uncomfortable conversations about my visual diary.
Once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Classroom Café. If you are a UFT member, the Members Assistance Program can be reached at 212-701-9620 or at mapinfo@uft.org.